A couple weeks ago, I had Mavius Lynn on this channel to discuss what is Thelema, which is the religion and the philosophy that Aleister Crowley left behind. But in that conversation, we weren't diving too deep into Aleister Crowley himself. It was more so about the practice of Thelema. So today I have Dr. Richard Kaczynski to come on the channel to discuss the life of Aleister Crowley. He is considered by many people to be Aleister Crowley's official biographer. So if you're unaware, Aleister Crowley is arguably one of the most famous and controversial figures in occultism. He lived from 1875 to 1947, and he is a very nuanced, complicated, controversial icon. But I wanted to put a disclaimer here before we get into the interview. This discussion isn't going to be on every single controversy that Crowley has ever been part of. It is going to be based on the facts, and it is going to be a dive into his psyche. I really enjoyed this conversation today. By the way, I mispronounced his last name, and I want to put that last disclaimer in here before we begin. It's Dr. Richard Kaczynski. I mispronounced that in the beginning of this video, and though he doesn't care and he said he didn't mind at all, I just want to come here to say I mispronounced his name. That is the correct pronunciation. Okay, now we can commence the conversation about this controversial icon. Dr. Richard Kaczynski is a writer of multiple books. One of the books is called Perdurabo, The Life of Aleister Crowley. This is what we are going to be discussing today. And I'm a little over 100 pages through. I'm just at the point where he has left the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and he climbed this giant mountain, and the story is really intriguing and it just pulls you in. So we're going to be talking about the life of Aleister Crowley today. So welcome, Richard, to the channel. I'm so pleased and honored to have you here. This is a really big deal for me. So thank you for taking the time.
Oh, well, you're welcome. It's my pleasure, and I'm glad that you invited me to be on your channel, and thank you for reading the book, even though you're kind of just getting into the good stuff. But again, thank you for reading and for
I
having me
know.
on.
I wanted to get so much further in your book before our interview, but in my book club, we're also reading two other books this month, so I'm like trying to juggle three different books at the same time. Do you want to talk about some upcoming projects for yourself? I know you've got two new books coming out, and then also anything about yourself that you feel like you want to share.
Yeah, I've got two books coming out this year in April. There's going to be a reissue of the critical edition I did of Aleister Crowley's book, The Sword of Song, which is a collection of poems and essays and stories and things like that, but they're all kind of talking about Crowley's kind of assessment of the various spiritual paths he had encountered in his lifetime just before he receives the Book of the Law. And it is his first kind of talismanic book, meaning it's a book that he designed and published with a magical intent. And it's been kind of a hard book for people to access, but also in both in the physical sense, but also in the comprehensive sense of reading it. So there's a lot of notes that I've added to the book to kind of help explain some of the current events and other things that he references in the book. And so that's actually coming out on April 8th. And then later this year in October, I'll be releasing a book called Mind Over Magick, which is me kind of going back to my roots in psychology and talking about research in psychology that actually has relevance to what we do as magicians. Not in any way to kind of psychologize magic or say it's all comes down to psychology, but just recognizing the fact that everything we do as human beings involves psychology in some way or another, and just say, hey, what does what we know about psychology tell us? How does it inform what we do as magical practitioners?
I am really excited for that book. Just being a psychology major myself, I saw that when you posted it on your Instagram, and I was like, oh, I have to have that book. I can't wait for it. So
No, I can't wait for you to read it.
yeah.
And everyone else too. Yeah.
Okay, great. There's a lot of people that really consider you to be Aleister Crowley's official biographer. This book, even though I'm only a little over 100 pages in, it's so factual. It's not based on this grandiose story of made up things just to make Crowley look more interesting or more wicked than he actually is. And I really love that you were laying out the facts without a ton of personal bias so that someone can kind of make up their own mind about who Aleister
Crowley actually is, because he is a controversial man. So I wanted to bring us all the way back to his early life, really talking about his childhood. We'll start from the beginning and then work our way forward, because in your book, I was reading that he really had an affluent upbringing. He had great education, but it was also very, very strict religiously. And there was a lot of religious oppression. So I was hoping that you could talk about that a little bit further as to how you feel like that shaped Crowley's life as far as spiritually, magically speaking, growing up in this religious oppression and needing to rebel and express that freedom later on. Would you elaborate on that?
Sure, sure. And actually, I wanted to start by acknowledging what you said up front about the recognizing the fact that I've been making an effort to just kind of present the facts of Crowley's story. One of the motivating factors, if not the motivating factor for me to write this story, is that so many other biographies have tried to push like a point of view on the reader, and the narrator, the biographer, is consistently weighing in, commenting on Crowley's life, and more often than not, trying to portray him in a negative light. And my motivation in writing this book was to put out the facts and just trusting my readers to be intelligent enough to read the facts and draw their own conclusion. I didn't want to come in here trying to be either an advocate or a critic of Crowley, but just someone who was trying to relay the facts. I do think, love him or hate him, his story is very fascinating. So I just wanted to share that with other readers. But in terms of his upbringing, absolutely, I think both the fact that he came from an affluent background and from a very conservative religious background had a lot to do with how he turned out. But it's not just those two things, because there's a lot of affluent religious people who don't become the prophets of a new religious movement. But it's how those things played out in his life. So, I mean, if we look at the religious aspect, for instance, he was a member of the movement called the Brethren, or that's the term they use inside that faith, but the outside world refers to them as the Plymouth Brethren, for clarity. And they're considered to be like one of the strictest and fundamentalist sects of Christianity. One writer talked about them being like the most bigoted sect on earth, because they had these frequent schisms within their community over what in many cases was very minor points of doctrine. So young Aleister Crowley would have seen, his religious and social community, being, we're all the people who are righteous and going into heaven one day, and then the next day, half of those people are sinners who are going to hell. And this again plays out with this whole idea of him kind of reacting against a lot of the intolerance of religion. Crowley's father was a lay preacher, and Crowley idolized his father. And I think the fact that Crowley himself kind of became a lay preacher of his own, belief system is kind of an ironic sort of Crowley following in his dad's footsteps. But what winds up happening is Crowley's dad dies, ironically enough, of tongue cancer when Crowley's at that tender, early teen age. And consequently, he winds up acting out at school. And, he's going to these very strict religious institutions, and his acting out is met with punishment that was so severe that he came down with an illness that nearly killed him. And when his father died also, his mom tried to carry on, the work of her deceased husband, and her brother, Crowley's uncle, Tom Bond Bishop, tried to step in and tried to be kind of a guiding force in his life. And young Crowley was having none of this. It's just like his father's image was hallowed, and these other people were like interlopers, and they're trying to be this influence on his life, just met with the most resistance. And so all of these things combined kind of led to him pushing back against that upbringing. And then when he went off to Cambridge University, he was out of the watchful eye of his tutors and his family, and he was free to do what any college person does, and they explore, whether it be, and for Crowley, a lot of that poetry, it was poetry. He discovered literature that was forbidden to be read in the house because it wasn't biblical, and so on and so forth. So this pushing back against the religious authoritarianism that he had in his lifetime, in his childhood, was something that he could just continue doing. It was part of his makeup and part of everything he did. Even though at the end of his life, he actually advised his son in a letter that he should actually study the Bible and the works of Shakespeare, because these are like the greatest works of literature, and that they'll teach you how to write, and they'll also give you kind of a basis for understanding so much of the cultural references in the world. So, even though he kind of pushed against that, he still recognized the value. And when in his confessions, I believe he writes, he didn't so much hate God or Jesus, but the God or Jesus of the people that he hated. So the thing is more that sort of oppressiveness about it. And the second piece is, the affluence. Crowley had a lot of money. He inherited the equivalent of like $5 or $6 million when, he became of age. And he went through that in very short order. Part of that was publishing his books at cost, particularly the Magick stuff. He didn't want anyone to accuse him of profiting off the great work. So he tended to print these very lavish books and try to sell them at cost. But he also did stuff like, outfitting and financing, Himalayan mountaineering expeditions and just living a very lavish life. And while he had the money, he spent it very generously, on his friends, picking up the tabs and doing things like that. And he had this ethic that, a lot of what he was doing was, spending his fortune on the great work, educating humanity about, the work of magic he was doing. And he kind of expected his students to do the same thing, which was kind of a big ask, really, because not all of his students are, again, they're not the prophet of this religion. They're kind of followers, but he still kind of expected his students to kind of make the same kind of commitments that he did. But the other part of it was that, he was just so generous and free with his money when he had it, that when he didn't, he kind of expected other people to, cover him. And it wasn't always the same people, so there were like friends that he picked up the tab for, and there was new people came into his life, and he's like, why is Crowley always kind of expecting me to pay for everything? It's like, well, in his mind, it's like, I've done this with everyone else. Why aren't you doing the same, following my lead? So I think the affluence kind of led to some of the attitudes as well.
I do find the identity of Crowley really interesting, like how he formed his identity, particularly in terms of the names he embodied, because he had so many different names. Well, first of all, he was Alec as a child, is what I learned from your book. And he was born as, was it Edward Alexander Crowley was
Correct.
his legal name, and then he adopted Aleister Crowley. That was not even his legal name, which I actually did not know that. He also became Perdurabo upon entering the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And then I've also heard that he was called Alice on occasion, or that he preferred to be called Alice and use she, her pronouns. So I was hoping you could kind of elaborate on the development of all of these names, because it really, to me as an outsider, it seems like Crowley didn't really either know what his true identity was or had a hard time figuring out who he was. So I would love to hear you speak on that.
Yeah, well, I think the Aleister thing is the easiest thing to address first off, is that, Alec was just what people called him in the house. My family called me Ricky, when I was growing
Yeah.
up. That's not necessarily what I go by as an adult. And when he basically took the Gaelic form of his middle name, Alexander, so he came up with Aleister, and he also kind of liked the meter of it, Aleister Crowley. His opinion was that a lot of famous people had that meter to their name, and so he kind of adopted Aleister kind of consciously too, because he liked that meter. Perdurabo is, it's a tradition in ceremonial magic, but also in other, occult traditions that on initiation you take a magical name. And so Perdurabo, which means, or can be translated as I shall endure, or I shall endure to the end,
Mhm.
was kind of his expression of his intent upon entering the Golden Dawn. And with various other degrees he took in the Golden Dawn or other advancements in his spiritual path, he did take on other identities as well. For instance, when he became a national head of the OTO, he took on the name Baphomet, which is actually kind of hilarious if you think about this, because Baphomet was this figure that the Templars were accused of worshiping, and in like the previous generation just before Crowley, and this is in Crowley's lifetime, in the late 1890s, there was this sort of crazy conspiracy theory about the Masons and the Catholic Church worshiping this, goat-headed god Baphomet and things like that. And so for Crowley to take on his motto as the head of the Oriental Templars, the name of the god that they were accused of worshiping and tortured and murdered over, and is also part of this like conspiracy theory, is, I don't know, it's very tongue in cheek, it's, if like Crowley was alive today, he'd say, oh yes, I am, Sir Lizard Man, after, these conspiracy theorists who think the world is run by, these, secret lizard people or something. So it's very much kind of playing on this sort of conspiracy theory that, he was very familiar with growing up. But also, I mean, these use of these names, it was often very serious, with different advances, particularly in some of the more, advanced degrees of his attainment. He took on different mottos, kind of expressing where he was at that time. And so for Crowley, he kind of consciously wrote under these different names because they represented different points of view. So if he wrote as Aleister Crowley, that was kind of Crowley the man, the poet, and all that sort of stuff. But if he was writing as, Tomega Therion, he was writing as, the magus, the prophet of Thelema. But if he was writing as, Baphomet, he was writing as, head of the British OTO, or if he used the name Phoenix, he was writing as international head of the OTO. And so a lot of times with his writings, the name that he uses represents kind of the point of view that he was coming from with that particular writing. And he says, there are some things he might write under one name that he would never have said under the other names. So keeping that in mind sometimes helps to keep track of where Crowley was. But then we get to this whole Alice thing that you brought up. And this is a name that recurs actually at several points over his lifetime. So it seems to be kind of this enduring or recurring thing. In the 1900s, he was hanging out with some of this is after he graduated, but he had kind of come back to Cambridge and Trinity College. And was hanging out with some of the students there, kind of, looking to recruit. But like one of the students there, Kenneth Martin Ward, was corresponding with him, and he addressed Aleister Crowley as Alice, and likewise signed himself with the fem name as well. And I haven't ventured to kind of go into that with in my book Friendship and Doubt, where I point this out because it's kind of off the topic, but. Crowley also ends up using the nomen of Alice, like 15 years later when he's at the Abbey of Thelema. And there would be times where he would, according to the story, he would put up a sign that said Alice is in or something like that and hang it over the bed to signify when he was kind of feeling in more of a feminine mood. And even in the 1930s, his secretary, Israel Regardie, after they kind of broke, they were having some words with each other. And, there's this note that, Regardie sends to him saying, Alice, you really are a contemptible bitch. So there was that piece of his identity that was like gender fluid or gender non-conforming. And, Crowley certainly was queer or bisexual. And, I think that's just kind of an expression that was, part of Crowley's person as well.
Sure. Do you think that Being bisexual or gender fluid, kind of deviating for a second, but do you think that just being a polyamorous bisexual person, not really sure of their gender identity in the Victorian era, do you think that kind of led to him having all of these different archetypes that he was exploring and not really being able to settle on any one thing in particular? I know he probably got a lot of heat in the Victorian era for not conforming to what society deems appropriate at the time.
Yeah, and that certainly seems to be a lot of why the Golden Dawn people kind of bristled at his presence, because he did not conform to their expectations of what someone in proper society does. Even though the Golden Dawn people were like artists and political activists and things like that, but for some reason, Crowley was, you know, particularly not a good fit or not welcome there, and some of that does come down to this. His queerness, that and certainly at his time, Oscar Wilde was put in prison for being gay, and even in Crowley's lifetime, we or after Crowley's lifetime, we see what happened to people like Alan Turing and things like that. So usually what winds up happening is when you're reading Crowley, he's usually pretty forthright and clear about what he's saying, but every once in a while he'll kind of dance around a subject. And I've kind of learned that when he's being a little bit evasive in his writings, it's usually he's talking about sex, because those are the things that could get you thrown in prison. And I don't think for Crowley it's so much a matter that he wasn't sure of his identity, but I think it's just that he contained multitudes. And for him, he was just kind of trying, assuming a point of view, or as how he was looking or expressing himself. But I think, all of those things were, he recognized that all being himself, but it's just, kind of clarifying where he was coming from with a particular, at a particular time.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. And we're going to be diving more into some of the misconceptions and also some of the controversies momentarily. But I wanted to ask you about his overall life legacy. What do you think he wanted his legacy to be? And do you think he actually achieved that? Or do you think that his legacy is something different?
Well, I think there's kind of two answers to that in terms of his legacy. I think the obvious answer is that his legacy was this idea of thelema, which is the Greek word for will, and his statement, "Do what thou wilt," should be the whole of the law, which essentially is a call for everyone to find their calling, their place in life, their true nature, and to focus all of their energy on fulfilling that aspiration, kind of becoming the thing that they, or being, the best version of themselves, or that, that model, that ideal, just as Perdurabo kind of represents, that motto, that ideal of what they want to do. And likewise, that while aspiring to do that for yourself, you give others the space and the grace to do that as well. One might say that for Crowley, the first rule of Thelema Club was mind your own business. And I think the world would be a much better place if that were true. There's just so much anger and hatred and cruelty in our world, historically, but also today, due to people who want to force their views on others, whether it be through legislation, through war, through torture. I mean, history is just riddled with this stuff. And if we just gave people the space to say, you're different. What you want in life is different from what I want in life. You do you, I'm going to do me. I think we'd be better off. So I think that's kind of the legacy that Crowley aimed for. But I also think another piece that for me is very important is that there's this positivity, this not only sex positivity, but life positivity that's part of Thelema. At the time that Crowley received the Book of the Law, which was this sort of channeled document, if you will, Crowley considered himself to be a Buddhist, a Theravada Buddhist specifically, which is a rather literal and conservative take on Buddhism. He actually lived in India and studied with Alan Bennett, his mentor in the Golden Dawn, who then went to India and became like the first British, emissary, or missionary rather, of Buddhism coming back to the West. And he actually stayed there studying Buddhism with Alan Bennett, who at that point was a bhikkhu or a monk. And so he was not this casual consumer of Buddhism, but he was very serious about it. And the first noble truth of Buddhism is this idea called dukkha, or sorrow, that existence is fundamentally sorrow. And it stems from this idea that we live in this world of illusion, and the perception of separateness and impermanence is also an illusion, but this illusion causes us to become attached to people and things. And when people die or things decay and we lose them, that causes us sorrow, and it causes us to become attached to this world. And it's that attachment to this world that causes us to reincarnate, but that attachment fundamentally causes us sorrow. Mm-hmm. So now imagine Crowley. And also I'm reminded that when Crowley was, again in his late 20s, he sent out like this postcard for New Year's Eve, wishing everyone a speedy termination of their existence. So, your typical 20 something, edgelord sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And again, he's still in his late 20s at the time when he's receiving this book of the law. So he's sitting here at this desk. This entity, Aiwass, is dictating the book of the law to him, and he's writing it down. And at one point, Aiwass says, "Existence is pure joy." And Crowley's like, "What? Existence is sorrow? What the hell do you mean by that?" And Aiwass, kind of picking up on this, says, and this is actually in the book of the law, "I see thee hate the hand and the pen, but go on." And so this idea that existence is actually joyful rather than sorrowful kind of flew right in the face of everything that Crowley believed at that time. And my take on this, and this is again just me talking here, but it's that you can take this view of reality that everything around here is an illusion, and that the separation of it is an illusion and decay is an illusion, but we're here for a limited time, and so long as we're aware of its illusion, we may as well enjoy the light show, enjoy being here. And in fact, those sorts of sentiments kind of get echoed in the Book of the Law, where in the first chapter, the sky goddess Nuit, who in Thelema represents like infinite possibilities, all things, says, "I'm divided for love's sake, for the chance of union." And goes on to say that the joy or the pain of division is nothing, and the joy of dissolution is all. And dissolution in the sense of like dissolving your consciousness into the universal consciousness. And I don't know, that to me is the most beautiful expression, an idea that comes out of the Book of the Law, and this idea that we are here to kind of experience this world, to unite with the experiences of this world. And that leads not only to kind of this sex positivity, because that's really one aspect in life where we really can dissolve our consciousness, in ecstasy with another person, and treats that as a sacred thing, but also that just life in general can be relished and can be lived and enjoyed, as opposed to this sort of body negative, world negative view that a lot of religion takes. And that's certainly kind of the case with Crowley's upbringing as well, in the fundamentalist group, that all things of the flesh and of the body are sinful, but there's the next world. And instead Crowley's saying, no, this world is great. Let's enjoy it while we can. And so I really love that. And I wish those were the legacies that people took with Crowley, but unfortunately, again, there are a lot of hysteria, a lot of negative PR that Crowley's received in his lifetime and after his lifetime that has led people to kind of come up with a lot of misperceptions of Crowley. So, Ozzy Osbourne and his song and whatnot. But I think there's still a lot of pushback in a lot of communities from people who necessarily don't know the facts about Crowley, but they're kind of like repeating what they've heard about Crowley. And again, for that, I just hope that people can read something like Perdurabo or just get the facts. And if you conclude you don't like him, that's fine, but at least do that from a place of knowledge rather than a place of, I don't know, rumor or whisper campaigns or, TikTok videos or whatever. Find out for yourself.
That's what I really appreciate about your book so far, even though again, I'm not quite halfway through yet, but I love how fact-based it is, and that way the reader can really make up their own decision on Crowley. I think people have this tendency to look at someone and automatically label them as all bad or all good, and there isn't a lot of room for nuance. Did he perhaps do some sketchy things? Maybe. Did he also leave a lot of good in this world with some of the Thelema principles? Absolutely. There's a lot of nuance to it. And so that kind of brings me into talking about misconceptions and also just the controversy. Obviously, in the introduction that I will have hopefully filmed separate from our conversation here, we're not going to be going into every single controversy that Crowley has ever been involved in. That's
We'd be
obviously
here all
not
day.
right. We'd be here all day. That's not what this conversation about. This conversation is more about getting into the mind of this influential occultist. But I have heard that the stereotype of him being this wicked man, or everything that we seem to know about Crowley as far as the controversies go, are false. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think a lot of it is a fabrication?
Yeah, I mean, first off, the question is what is wicked? And wicked ultimately is kind of based in some system of morality, and typically that's kind of the prevalent Judeo-Christian morality of the time in which Crowley lived, and which Crowley was happy to kind of push back against. But at the same time, the time that the Sunday Express newspaper labeled him the wickedest man in the world was during the time of the rise of Mussolini. So if you're going to say Crowley is wickeder than Mussolini or any number of other awful people in the world, Stalin or whatever, that's hyperbole. That's not literally true. And nevertheless, Crowley kind of got dogged with that. But what has Crowley done that's wicked? Did he lie? Well, actually, I kind of found it as his biographer going through his confessions, his autobiography, that I was able to verify most of what he says through census records or newspaper articles or other archival research. Does he have a point of view? Sure, but he's generally pretty honest about describing his life. Did he murder people? Was he a mass murderer? Well, there's this one time he was being mugged in an alley, in India, and he happened to have a revolver in his pocket, and he managed to get a shot off that hit one of his muggers and killed them. But that was in self-defense. And of course, there's places, here in the US where that's totally okay, stand your ground, But it's not like this was, so I don't know. I mean, what is wicked, And I think about the movie Wicked now, which kind of, in a very different sense, kind of talks about how these labels that we give to people are often exaggerated, if not untrue. So no, I don't think Crowley was wicked. He was someone who had a philosophy that he dedicated his life to trying to get out there and to share with the world. And he spent $6 million, the $6 million man, trying to get this word out. And even when he ran for his money, that didn't stop him. Even when people were calling him the wickedest man in the world or a man we'd like to hang, he didn't flinch or turn away from what he saw as his mission. And so I don't know, I find that to be something to respect. I mean, he walked the walk.
Sure. There is a little bit of an element. This is what I'm receiving from it. Please correct me. I want to hear your opinion on this. But he seems a little bit like a trickster energy in that he's like, okay, well, if you're going to call me wicked, I'll show you the most wicked you've ever seen, as, just kind of as a rebellion thing more than anything. I don't know. He seems like he has that trickster energy to him where he's just going to say, fuck it. They're going to call me wicked anyways. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that he necessarily went out of his way to be wicked. I think it was just his pushing back against norms, against, before he became a Buddhist, he was also a free thinker, which was this movement that was trying to get religion out of public life. Basically saying, our laws and our policies should be evidence-based, not based on any religious text.
Sure.
And so a lot of what he did in terms of his, I don't know, his promiscuity, his embracing, other religions and trying to promote those things, were, of course, shocking to, Victorian or Edwardian sensibilities. But for him, this is just like, we're doing something new now. This is the new eon. We're the way things work are different now, and you're kind of hanging on to these old attitudes. So I think the things he did were shocking, but I don't think it was necessarily calculated to shock, just as he was being, again, authentic.
Sure.
But at the same time, I'm reminded of some of the words of one of his students and colleagues, Gerald York, who cautioned against trying to kind of, I don't know, excuse or whitewash, that was the term he used, Crowley's life, because in many ways he was this iconoclast, this person who challenged convention, and that is kind of his role as trying to introduce this new era of mankind. And Gerald York says, that a whitewashed beast is no good at all. That's this idea that by calling himself the beast, he was kind of invoking these images that in his mind meant one thing, but for the general public meant something else. And it was kind of, by forcing people to engage with this that he, sought to overturn a lot of, these social norms that he thought were, harmful and repressive.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up his personal journals as well, of course, because again, we're talking about a nuanced conversation here. As far as the journals go, I was recently made aware that, there are some racist comments in his journals, and not just some racist comments, but seemingly more racist than his time. So I was hoping that you could maybe elaborate on his public persona versus his private persona. I don't know if you've read all of his journals or not. I'm assuming, I don't really know, so you'll have to let me know. I obviously have not read them at all, but what is the discrepancy between his public self and his private self and those journals, and how do you think that kind of reflects the time that he was writing those in?
Yeah. I would say that Crowley, I think, tried very hard to be transparent. I don't think he had like a public face versus a private face. Or I guess like when you read his journals, it seems very obvious that he expected other people would eventually be reading these things. So I think his diaries in some cases are are self-conscious. But in terms of the racism, I think that's a complicated question to answer. And so if you'll kind of allow me with a little bit of a preface here, there is actually some recent psychological research that talks about how in ages past, and not too long ago, that those who held nuanced opinions are historically viewed as people who have taken the time to kind of look at the facts and kind of weigh them and come up with a deep understanding of a particular topic. But we have, in these last few years, entered this phase of life through social media algorithms and politics and everything else, where our society has become very, very polarized. And people seem to want black and white answers. And it's now the case that people who try to have nuanced views tend to be shunned by both extremes, and I think like a perfect example of that is kind of this whole, Israel-Palestine thing. I don't want to get like political about this, but the idea is, well, if you're pro-Palestine, then that makes you anti-Semitic, but if you're pro-Israel, then that makes you pro-genocide against the Palestinian people, and there's like no middle ground there to say killing anyone is bad, and so I kind of feel like when we talk about this racism question, it's kind of in a similar sort of position. So I guess I will start by saying that yes, Aleister Crowley, without debate, wrote some things in his journals and in his books which were racist, sexist, and problematic in other ways. In my introduction to the Sword of Song, I kind of acknowledge that and just say, hey, there's some stuff he wrote back then that looks very bad, through today's eyes. And the fact that, someone who grew up in, a colonizing culture, at the peak of the British Empire, being raised in the sect of the most bigoted religion on earth, I guess one would not be surprised to find him espousing some of those views. And I'm in no way trying to excuse or forgive those statements, because they're, I am absolutely and utterly opposed to racism, sexism, and all those other forms of prejudice and discrimination. But at the same time, recognize that Crowley also said some rather radically inclusive things for his time. The Book of the Law, for instance, has this comment, every man and every woman is a star. So it's not like every white tech bro is a star. It's like everybody is divine. And in some of his other writings, he kind of, even elaborates that, because, every man and woman seems kind of, again, black and white. And so he actually says every man, woman, and intersex being, so being somebody who is, kind of genderqueer himself, he kind of leaves room for that. And he felt that with, the racial barriers as well. I mean, this is, we're talking about Crowley as somebody who actually lived in India, studied Hinduism, studied Buddhism on site. He traveled in China. He, got to know the people there. He incorporates, the traditions of Kabbalah very, very seriously. This is not like some sort of fancy or whatever. That he actually made a very serious study of this. He basically cast, I Ching oracles every day to kind of look at how his day and and understand where his life was going. So he very much embraced the spiritual traditions of the world around him. And when in 1936-37, he was publishing his book, The Equinox of the Gods, which is kind of the story of how he got the Book of the Law. Part of his magical act of publishing this book was he rounded up like 6 or 7 people representing in his mind, the races of mankind, and presented each of them with a copy of the book, kind of to emphasize, magically speaking, that this philosophy is for everyone, that it's all inclusive. So I think, there's people out there who have gone through Crowley's stuff and kind of picked out all the racist things he's done, and there's people on the other side of the argument who have picked out like all the non-racist things he's done, and my take on this is that it's complicated. He's kind of little column A and little column B, and if you're looking for a black and white answer, I don't think there is one. And so my advice is to, again, take that deep dive. Don't just read one person's account where they've kind of cherry picked things out of context, but that note that Crowley was kind of a complicated person, and he, depending on the day or the context, could be one or the other, and we have to kind of understand him given those foibles. And one of the things about Crowley that I think is kind of interesting is that religious figures, they tend to be, held up and viewed as these perfect figures, Jesus and Buddha and so on. And Crowley, as kind of the prophet of this new eon, is none of those things. He's not perfect, and he doesn't pretend to be. He's a flawed human being. He's, he had divorces, he's had drug problems, he's blown through $6 million, in a very, and probably not the smartest way for, seeing himself through his life. But a imperfect person is somebody that in some ways is more identifiable with. It's like, wow, so now Crowley at times was a real fuck up. And if this fuck up can be, pursue the spiritual stuff, so can I. And I think in some ways that also almost makes this more approachable rather than, undercutting it in some ways. So I think we can look at what Crowley had to say, despite whatever, unsavory things he may have, said. I mean, there's, and kind of separate the person from the message.
Thank you for answering that question. I know that's an incredibly difficult one to do, but I wanted this conversation to be really well balanced and talking about, his legacy and getting into his mind, but then also some of the not so great things that he may have done. So I appreciate you holding space for us to even, be able to talk about that. And you definitely do an exceptional job as a biographer with that.
No,
You're
thank
able
you.
to kind of present both sides, or all sides of the story, I should say. So kind of switching to Crowley's outer world rather than his inner world, I wanted to talk more about his relationships because, and you feel free to talk about anybody you want to, whether it's his wife Rose or his business partners at any point. But I'm just so curious to hear your thoughts on how his relationships help shape his legacy and shaped his magical and spiritual work. And if there's any one relationship in particular that you want to talk about, this is just a free for all, whatever you feel like.
Golly. Well, that's tough because none of us live in a vacuum, and we're all kind of buffeted around, as it were, by the people that we encounter in our lifetimes. Rose, for example, his wife, I mean, if not for her kind of entering this trance-like state on their honeymoon and conveying to Crowley, hey, the gods have a message for you, there would not have been a Book of the Law. She was kind of an instrumental agent in that. And that's something I hope to talk about at the National OTO conference this summer if my paper gets accepted. So that's one thing, that this whole movement of Thelema doesn't happen without Rose, or if it does happen, it happens in a very different sort of. It's going to look very different. Gosh, relationships. There's so many. I mean, I think about one of the things that's kind of interesting is that Crowley hung out with a lot of people who are artistic and creative and famous in their own worlds for what they did. And that therefore opened up a lot of doors for him, so that when he was writing articles, he knew people who ran Vanity Fair or the English Review. And so it kind of gave him an edge to kind of get some of his stuff published that way. And so he wasn't just this guy screaming into the void, as we might feel that way sometimes, like when we're doing our thing on the internet. It's like who's actually seeing what we're doing. He was actually pretty well connected with people in, the arts, as it were, and those things, served him well and unlocked opportunities for him. I also think about one of his students, Frida Lady Harris, who was his artist, who, when they met, she kind of floated this idea of like, hey, we should do a tarot deck. And Crowley was like, yeah, we can do that. It'll take, maybe 6 months. We'll just take kind of the traditional designs and, you can knock that stuff out. Here's the Golden Dawn's, description of the tarot cards. And Frida Harris was the one who said, yeah, I don't like this. These descriptions are kind of dull. I've been kind of researching tarot decks in the British Library, and they all kind of look like going to the Renaissance Fair. I mean, my words, not hers, but I'm saying that, they have this backward-looking view. And she was an artist, when there was a lot of exciting things going on in art. There was Art Nouveau, Surrealism, Cubism, all this stuff was going on. She's like, I want to do a forward-looking deck. I don't want to follow and copy these old designs. And, she basically said to Crowley, and you've also spent your life developing this whole new system. What we should really do is design a tarot deck from the ground up. And so that was like her idea, her suggestion to Crowley, and, Crowley was kind of like, well, okay, we can do that, but it's going to take some time. And she's like, well, we'll sweeten the deal for you. She's trying to like convince him. It's just like, I'm a student. I don't really know enough about magic and all this stuff to really do justice to what you are working on. So how about I paid you a stipend so you to teach me magic, and that way that'll make me a better, artist and transmitter of your vision. And so all this, so it was basically her kind of nudging Crowley and kind of sweetening the pot for him that kind of got him to agree to do this Thoth Tarot deck, which is, arguably like next to the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, the second most popular tarot deck in the world, the most influential one.
Yeah.
So yeah, these relationships in his life certainly push him along in some of these directions. And and Crowley would, I think, would acknowledge that the gods or the powers that be would put people in his life at these particular times to serve as initiators or whatever to help him on the next path of his great work. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just as a side note, as I was reading your book, it really seems like he was also a bleeding heart romantic in terms of being a poet. I don't know, some of the things that I was reading and the terms of, oh, I'm so in love with this person, or he just seems
As
like
fleeting though it may be.
yeah, right. It's fleeting,
Yeah.
definitely. And then he moves on to the next one, but he really does master that brooding artist archetype, is what I was
Yeah, yeah. I
getting.
think of there's this set a collection of poems he wrote called Alice in Adultery, and he wound up being like on a boat with, sailing from San Francisco to Japan, or Honolulu to Japan. But he, carries on this affair with this woman that he meets on the boat, and she's married and's got her life to go back to. But for like the 50 days that they're on this cruise or this boat, whatever, he's writing a poem for her every day, and then it's all this passionate sort of stuff. And then when the cruise is over, it's like, thanks, have a good life.
Yeah.
And that seemed to be kind of the agreement they had. But Crowley, certainly in the moment was very prone to being kind of caught up in the romance and the excitement of it all. And
Yeah.
in some ways, perhaps he was a little, I don't want to use the word addicted to it, but I think he liked the that feeling of falling in love and of fresh love, because he
Mhm.
wasn't really very good at sustaining relationships long term. Um, so he winds up just going through, for most of his life, just going through a series of magical, romantic, sexual, and other partners.
Sure.
Um,
I do find his relationship, his marriage with Rose really interesting because when I was speaking to Mavius Lynn about Thelema, she was talking about their relationship a little bit further and how Rose was never someone, she didn't even want to get married. She was not, she was also very anti-purity Victorian culture as well, and she was very promiscuous. And so it's interesting that they found each other, and it sounds like they were able to have this kind of wonderful polyamorous dynamic where they were both free to explore, and that's kind of what they both wanted. I don't know, would you be able to shed light on their relationship?
yeah, well, I think that was the intent at the very least,
Sure.
because Rose was in love with this, I don't remember exactly who he was, a married guy who was offering to just kind of put her up in an apartment, but her parents wanted her to settle down with some guy. And Crowley was like, hey, well, here's the solution. Why don't you just marry me? I don't care. You can sleep with whoever you want. This will just get you out of your predicament. Um, and that was kind of the end of it. I think that the idea was you have your life, I'll have my life, and this would just be a thing that we do on paper. But then
Mm.
you know, despite those intentions, they wind up falling in love with each other. So
Hmm.
and then again, things kind of unraveled a few years later. But but for a time there, they actually were quite smitten with each other, and Crowley wrote some of his best poetry to her.
Yeah. Yeah, he definitely is a fleeting man when it comes to relationships, as you said. So it makes sense. So I want to talk about you and your writing process with this book, kind of pivoting away from Crowley, but this book is meticulous. It is so meticulous in the way that you put this together. And I really want to hear from you. What challenges did you have when writing this? Because we know that trying to figure out what is true and what is not when it comes to the controversies of Crowley, I can't even imagine how difficult that was. So, what were some of the biggest challenges for you in writing this?
Yeah, yeah. Well, in terms of meticulous, I guess I'll just say I do have Virgo moon. So
Okay, perfect. Yep, tracks.
um, challenges. Well, I think the biggest challenge was when I started working on this. This was like in the late 80s, early 90s. We didn't have the internet that we do today. And so one of the first things I did when starting to work on this book was, at this point I had read a lot of Crowley, and I think I'd gotten to this point where I read like one of the newer biographies and just said, this is a bunch of baloney. I'd read enough to know this is bullshit. I could do a better job. And this little voice in my head said, yeah, why don't you? So So I went through all the stuff that I had, which is pretty considerable. I mean, all of his books, the diaries that were published and everything else. And I was looking for names of people that he knew. They had like a list of like 700 names. And so my question was, well, are there letters, are there collections? Well, there's some of these big collections of Crowley's papers that we know of, like at the Warburg Institute, which, as a matter of fact, right now is having a big tarot exhibition, including some of the original Thoth tarot artwork.
Hmm.
But there, the Warburg Institute has a collection. The Harry Ransom Center down in Austin, Texas, has a big collection. But there may be stuff out there that we didn't know about. So I wanted to find out, well, who had collections from any of these 700 people? And most of these people aren't necessarily famous or have collections, but the only way to do this was there was this multi volume index that librarians called the NUCMUC, which is the National Union Catalog of Manuscript Collections or something like that. And I basically just went through and there are these big books, and you just look up people by name, and they list all the universities that have any papers by them. And so I just looked up all 700 people in the many volumes of the NUCMUC, and wrote. And for those who did have collections, I wrote to all these libraries saying, "Do you have anything by Crowley? Do you have anything by Crowley?" And churned up things that no one had seen before. And so the challenge was actually trying to track that stuff down. And then I kind of spent, a summer just kind of doing this massive road trip, around the Northwest, going from, Toronto and Syracuse and Pennsylvania State University and Washington, D.C., and all sorts of other points in between, visiting these collections. But other places were very kind in terms of offering to send me photocopies. I think it helped that at this time I was able to write. I was a graduate research assistant at this time, so I had like university email address, so I could kind of write from that address, and so they knew I was serious, and so I think that opened some doors for me as well. So the challenge is more of a logistical one, but the thing is, when I went to do the second edition of Perdurabo, the one that you have, things had changed so much. Newspapers had been digitized. Census records never, genealogical information had been digitized. And so it was really possible for me to kind of go back and trying to revise this book to look at things that were, not necessarily in archives, but just newspaper stories and things like that. Tracking down photographs, historical photographs of people. And that really allowed me to kind of revise and expand that book considerably to make it kind of that meticulous text that you talked about.
Yeah.
Because for me, it was one thing to say, oh, here's this name of somebody that Crowley knew, but then to say, oh, here, I've got a copy of their birth certificate. Oh, here's this thing in the newspapers, this thing they did. And for me, that just brought them to life. They weren't just like a name in a book. They were actually living, breathing people. And for me, that was very exciting. For some, the little capsule bios I give for people might be a little too much, but I mean, for me, it was just that just made it real. So I was happy to share that. And so for the most part, while there might be some resistance or pushback to the Crowley biographer, I've found people more often than not were very receptive. I remember one time a few years ago visiting the Theosophical Society headquarters in London, because I was going through their membership registers looking for, again, people whose names I recognized. And yeah, at one point as I'm going through all these books of, their records or membership logs of theirs, I overheard, two people in the hallway going, "You know who that is?" "No, who is that?" "Crowley." and I thought that was hilarious, but at the same time, it was like they were so kind and accommodating. So it's not like they were treating me badly, but I just kind of thought the Crowley thing was kind of funny. But again, they were just wonderful, and so I think I just having that. The reputation of having written this book and coming from a university background, people were, willing to take me seriously, and that opened some doors for me.
Yeah, I personally like the additional detail that you give because, in just reading Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn section where he was initiated in and his time spent there. I mean, you spent a good amount of time also talking about Mathers and that relationship. And it gave so much more perspective for me as an outsider to understand Crowley's significance there. So I appreciated the meticulous nature. I love a
Thank
good
you.
Virgo moon. So, I'm
Yeah,
totally
well, the
on
thing
board.
is, and again, Crowley didn't live in a vacuum, so you
Right,
kind of
right.
have to understand him in the context of his times,
Yeah.
and the extent to which, the times make things make sense, or times in which Crowley deviated from what was his times. I think that the context is, knowing, understanding the context is important. I learned so much in doing the research. Or just like, he knew famous people. Tom Dryburgh would go on to become an MP, and just various authors, whose stuff I'd never heard of. I wasn't exposed to them in like, in high school or whatever. So it's just, oh, who's James Branch Cabell? Oh, wow. This guy's
Yeah.
pretty cool, and so it was, for me, it was an education, not just in Crowley, but just in the world, writing this book.
Yeah. What was your favorite era to write about? And also, because I know that as far as fun facts go, because I wanted to ask you about fun facts too with Crowley, because he was a poet, he was a rock climber. A lot of people don't know his whole story with rock climbing, apart, outside of the world of occultism. And so, yeah, what spiritual era or just era in general did you find the most interesting to write about?
Well, I'll list very briefly three things. The first two I'll at least go over briefly. One is I thought that going over his genealogy was interesting because no one had done that before, and just kind of understanding where the generational wealth came from. And just, that his relatives like corresponded with Ben Franklin and stuff like that was pretty cool. Going into the rock climbing and the mountaineering was something I enjoyed doing because, again, most other biographers kind of glossed over that, whereas that was something very, very important to him, his life, and how he looked at the world. But in terms of my favorite part to write about, I think it was like his later years, because Crowley's own autobiography only goes up to about 1925, and he lived to 1947. So these last 22 years of his life weren't covered by his autobiography. And again, a lot of the other biographers I read got into a lot of detail through those first years of his life, and then just kind of those last 22 years were kind of dealt with much more briefly, I guess. And for me, those last 22 years or so of his life were very important because this is Crowley now in his maturity. He had spent his entire life studying magic, searching his mind or the astral planes or what have you, and just trying to understand the depth and complexity of the spiritual path.
Mhm.
And this is the time where a lot of his best work actually happens. He writes or gives the talks that become 8 lectures on yoga, which is just a fantastic collection of essays on yoga. Crowley has this reputation for being very hard to understand, and that's because a lot of his technical writing, like in Magic and Theory and Practice,
Mhm.
is directed towards students who one assumes will have read his other stuff or have access to papers that had not been published and so on. But 8 lectures on yoga were the lectures he gave publicly, and they are lucid and clear and simple, and I think they're really, really good. An example of the Crowley really being able to communicate when he wanted to. His writings on the Thoth Tarot. This again, it's him boiling down and distilling a lifetime of experience into and synthesizing it together into this book on the tarot, and so many other things that came out of that last period for me was really exciting to know. And there's also a lot of sort of sad things about his life too, because at this point, he'd been so thoroughly attacked by the press that his reputation made it hard for people to want to publish his works, and so he again winds up trying to scrounge together donations so he can self-publish some of his stuff and so on. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but I think there's just so much that happens in those last 22 years that's important. that it was really fun for me to write about that stuff and kind of do those last years justice because they rather than glossing them over the way others had done in the past.
Yeah. Well, as we're wrapping up here, I know you already talked about his legacy and such, but that kind of really just brings us into the last thing that I wanted to talk to you about was this overall community fascination with Crowley. I think that he is arguably the most famous occultist, in my opinion. I think he is. He's the one that's talked about most often. And I just wanted to ask you your opinion on this. Why do you think after all this time, there is this fascination with him?
Oh gosh, I think there's a variety of reasons. One of which I think is this idea that his reputation precedes him, whether that reputation is accurate or not. But I think he's someone that people have very strong feelings about, sometimes pro, sometimes con. And I think some of these feelings, particularly the con feelings, do come from a place of lack of information, let me say. There are people who will, I've heard them say, oh, Crowley's a drug addict. And that to me is kind of a intellectually lazy way of not engaging with the material. I mean, no one says, well, let's disregard Benjamin Franklin or Edgar Allan Poe because they were alcoholics, or let's, throw out psychoanalysis because Freud was a cocaine addict. Crowley, he was prescribed heroin medicinally for his asthma, and 2 points of his life. And so to say, dismiss him because he was a drug addict. I mean, it's again, I think it's intellectually lazy, but it also is kind of perpetuates a lot of stigma around people who do struggle with substance abuse, and that's not doing those people any favors by saying you are not worth considering. There's people who say, oh, he drove all of his mistresses to suicide, and there's basically what happened. There's this story where he was trying to repair his relationship with one of his younger partners, and he pulled the suicide stunt where he left a note at Boca do Inferno in Portugal, and kind of vanished. It was kind of a publicity stunt too, because he was trying to say, yeah, let's get together and you can write this novel about our eloping and being together, and so this is kind of a trick to kind of generate publicity and maybe get a publisher interested in publishing her story, which of course Crowley would ghostwrite. And when they finally broke up, this young lady left a suicide note of her own and then skipped back home to California. So, she didn't actually kill herself. And again, this is one of those things where until we had access to these digitized genealogy records, people were assuming that she did kill herself. And it's like, nope. She's in California. She pulled the suicide stunt on Crowley, who had pulled it on her first, So I think there's just a lot of misinformation out there. Again, I'm not out here trying to, as I said, I'm not trying to defend or criticize Crowley. I want people to, form their own opinions, but form those opinions based on looking at the facts rather than listening to what other people have to say. And
Yeah.
again, don't trust what I have to say. I mean, pick up the book, read it. I mean, I'm pretty meticulous about footnoting or noting things, I guess, end notes more than anything, and
Sure.
documenting, because my belief is that with the stuff that I write, it's we all build on the work of the people that come before us, and I want people to be able to retrace my footsteps, pick up the things that I picked up and documented, and as they want, to build on it, either whether about Crowley or somebody else that I've written about, but just to have that information there. So,
Sure.
again, find out for yourself and make your own opinion.
Thank you. That's fantastic closing statements. I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much, Richard, for coming on the channel. I really appreciate you being here and to shed light on all of this. I hopefully will edit the books up on the screen, but I'll also list your books in the description box
Oh,
below
thank you.
where people can find you on, because you're on Instagram as well, right? You do Instagram and
Instagram, Facebook, Blue
Okay.
Sky, just all over the place.
All of the networks. Okay. Yeah. Or all of those. Yeah. I'll list them in the description box. So thank you again. And thank you to everybody watching this video. I'll see you all in another video soon. Goodbye, everyone.